Namaste and in la catch, and welcome to this edition of One World in a New World. I'm your host, Zen Benefiel, and as always, I want to remind you of those two key phrases. Namaste comes from the Brahmi actually spoken. It's Sanskrit written, and it means the divine in me recognizes the divine in you. In Lak'ech comes from the other side of the world, the Mayan culture, and it simply means I am another you. Now, if you look at the view that we have right now with the Earth in the background, we're really one planet, one people. So shouldn't we treat each other that way? Right? Try it out. See what happens for you. All right, so this episode is featuring Dave Witzel. Now, I met Dave through the Global Regeneration CoLab, which is a really cool organization. We'll talk about that more. But he's also the chief of Conspiration with the Regenerative Agriculture Sector Accelerator. He's a graduate of Harvard Kennedy School with a master's of public policy. He's currently the convener for the Global Regenerative CoLab, which is a growing multidisciplinary network of innovators from around the world coming together to accelerate the transformation to a regenerative future. Now, there's a few questions that they ask. How might we unlock the flow of $30 trillion into the regenerative economy by 2030? How might we enable regenerative innovation ecosystems in 1,000 regions around the world? And how might we transform the value chains of the largest businesses on Earth to become regenerative by 2030? Great questions. We'll get to those later. But first, we're going to jump back into the Wayback Machine, and hopefully we won't lose Peabody or Sherman in the process. So Dave, welcome to the show.
Zen, thanks so much. What fun. It's good to see you.
Oh, great. It's good to be with you too, and in a much more intimate and one-on-one environment that I think can be really advantageous for our listeners. So when you began this journey of self, right, because I think that's part of what becoming a regenerative entrepreneur and getting involved in that movement is about. It's the harmony with self, others, and nature, right? So how did that first come up for you? How did you recognize that interconnection that you had, and what drove it?
Yeah, I've been kind of going back through that for myself, because I'd like to try to help other people kind of have a similar experience. I was like, well, how did I do it? And there's a couple of pieces I put together. One is I was at a conference that was organized by David Hodgson, and I was talking with Mark Barash, who's an author and thinker, and Mark was talking about his regenerative agriculture projects in Africa. And kind of that, I know the day that it happened, I said, regenerative, that's a much better idea. We could be better than we can make the world better than it is. We don't have to settle for, not quite as bad.
Right.
And
now, for our listeners, would you mind defining what regenerative is, what that means?
Well, in one simple sense, I think it is just that as a contrasted with something that is sustainable, regenerative is better than sustainable is not quite as bad. So you wouldn't want to sustain a degraded piece of land, for example. You want to regenerate it. And the other contrast that I think is often helpful is regenerative is not extractive. If you're extracting, you're taking away from society. If you're regenerative, you're contributing to. So it was that sense of contributing to, of having a better future as opposed to kind of a less bad future that was motivating.
So is it kind of like paying more attention to the rhythms and cycles of nature and aligning with that in the agricultural development and restoring regions to their semi-natural origins?
Yeah, I wrestle with this. I don't actually do any agriculture myself. I came at the idea of regeneration from a really intellectual kind of just a meta space. And I've been working for Environmental Defense Fund on sustainability, and we were trying to stop climate change by helping companies be more energy efficient. Which, if you think about it,
that had to be fascinating and challenging.
It was also kind of hopeless, right? You're not going to stop climate change by making companies more energy efficient. It's a fool's errand.
Well, it can make a difference in the condition of the air, water, and land.
Yeah, it's not a bad thing to do,
Right.
but it's not sufficient. Was my if the environmental agencies were incredibly successful at their work, they would not address the problems that they were organizing around,
Right.
which is not an encouraging position to be in. And I think I had a mindset block at that idea of kind of energy efficiency, which I think of as net zero. It's like, everybody should try to get to net zero. It's like, well, actually, we need something better than net zero, right? We need to go beyond. And once I was able to kind of see this possibility, the potentiality of going beyond, it just felt like it opened up a lot of new paths for me. And so regeneration to me is a policy prescription for, our policies and our work and our businesses should make the world, better than it was, not, and that actually is just it was a new bar for me. And it turns out that if you go visit a truly regenerative farm, what you'll find is a farm where you're sequestering carbon, so you're helping with the climate change. So you're retaining water, you're helping support fresh water, you're reducing pollution, you're increasing the nutrition of food, you're increasing the biodiversity around the farm, both the things that you're going to eat and the wildlife around it. You're probably generating new jobs, you're having a healthier lifestyle, all at the same time. So a regenerative farm is an example of this making the world better concept in a tidy little package that you can go visit. And if you haven't yet, please go visit a regenerative farm in your neighborhood and touch it for yourself, because it's a very visceral thing, you can tell.
It really is. I have a old friend, dear friend, that he was one of the first pioneers here in the Valley, the Phoenix area, with permaculture. And his home, he's been in for 20 some odd years. He calls it the urban farm, right? And everything around it is, all the plants are edible, fruit trees and vegetables and all that kind of stuff. And why not? I mean, it just kind of makes sense, doesn't it?
Well, and again, it had not really occurred to me. And then, it goes back to, so the answer to your question about, is it about conservation or returning to nature? It's like, well, kind of, but not really, because people are still involved in this loop. So it's the idea that what we want is to have people removed from the environment or the context doesn't seem right. We are here. We are part of nature. We belong in that.
Right.
So that should continue, but we're contributing to it, not extracting from it. And that really was the difference.
Sure. Yeah. Learning to work with it rather than against it.
I think that's a big chunk of it. And that people can be good for the environment is just kind of a thought that I don't think we think often enough.
Sure. Well, the way life has been, and we euphemistically call it a rat race, because we are so busy, we're running around and we're not paying attention to things. So these kinds of considerations really haven't been part of our mindset for many years. So I'm really, personally, I'm happy, I'm like you, I'm not involved with agriculture. I do my best to support the efforts because it just makes sense, right? The more we can do that and support those that are attempting to organize and build and do things differently, that is more supportive of the human race as well as the environment, then we will move forward together in a way that's more probably ultimately productive for us as well. And
yeah, that's got to be the goal, right?
Yeah, especially coming out of COVID now, where we've had the time to sit and think and wonder, many things. First of all, but more importantly, who are we? What are we doing here? How do we behave better towards each other? And can we be caring and compassionate, right? Because there's this confusion and frustration and somewhat of a fear-based attitude of people toward each other. And so that needs to change. And we've got I think that's the silver lining in it all, is we have the opportunity to do so, and there are people that are stepping up to do that. And the amazing thing with GRC is David starting it in 2019, just prior to this happening. And so it was like perfect timing. Now, whether he planned it or not, the universe has a way of setting things up, and people in the right places at the right time with the right initiative step up and do the work that's necessary. Now, the question of the interconnection with that, how did you equate that, or was there a bridge between what's happening with the outer world and what was going on internally as you were recognizing these features and benefits of regenerative philosophy?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I had, personally, kind of from an internal perspective, I'd been kind of searching a little bit for, I think of it as the last part of my productive life, kind of where I wanted to make a contribution. And the work at Environmental Defense Fund had been a piece of this, and I'd come out of an internet background. So I wanted, and I felt like the internet is an amazing thing that humans have constructed, and we ought to learn from how we've constructed it. We had to use those tools in more places, and I thought that we could use it in the environmental space. With not, some mixed success, I'd say. There's some things that work, but not a lot of other things.
Well, it's still new, right? I mean, relatively speaking, we think that it's been around, we're used to it, but it's still a new feature for our lives.
Yeah, well, certainly for us old guys. For the younger people, it's all they've ever known.
Hey, now.
But
it's good being old, right?
But it's got a generation or two behind it now. So, and I think that I still feel like we haven't studied enough. I mean, like, with this one level of what does it do today, but there's another level of how did we create it? And I think that arguably it's the largest engineering project that people have ever created. It involves more people, more complexity, more reach than pretty much anything we've ever done.
Absolutely.
And I think we, kind of don't give that enough credence. And it's like, my thought was like, how do we do it? How do we do it again? Kind of. But then I realized also that that's like a tool without a purpose, I guess. It doesn't have a direction. The tool can, as we're seeing today, you can do all kinds of good and bad things with the internet. And so then this notion of a regenerative future, which I think is, pretty much a better future, became the motivation for trying to use these collaborative tools. And to me, they fit together. That as we're going into, one way to think of this is that we really want to have regeneration. We really need to think beyond just a farm, for example. You need to think of a landscape or a watershed. It's kind of the farm, and it's the river that leads to the city, that leads to the port. And all of these things are interrelated and interconnected. And so it's those connections in that ecosystem that we're trying to grapple with simultaneously. It's kind of a new level of engagement for most people. And I think it's another level of complexity that society has to deal with. So.
Very much so. And the complexity is somewhat overwhelming initially, especially for those that are beginning to explore it and figure out how to connect others that are in it, looking for, other groups that are similar, like GRC and those that have still kind of come out of it with the industrial age technology or mindsets of silos and alpha males or females at the top. And so there's still this, not necessarily that they're alpha males or females, but there's definitely silos that don't know about each other. They're not necessarily in competition now. But how do you see that evolving, and especially with the internet, and do you see the internet as kind of an expression of the global brain just waiting to be picked?
I guess so the GRC, the Global Regeneration CoLab, as you're saying, David Hodgson founded it in 2019. I joined a couple of months later. and it is a little bit a creature of the pandemic. I think I don't think it would have formed the way it did if it hadn't been for the pandemic. And I think the orientation of what its role is has continued to focus and evolve. But I would say today that the Global Regeneration CoLab is intended as peer-to-peer support for regeneration change makers. So there are people who want to have a regenerative impact on the world. They're working on projects, they're developing ideas, they're writing blog posts, making podcasts, and they're still working in a pretty loosely formed space. It's not really cohesive. So this is a place where you get moral support and coaching and new ideas, and new connections and resources, and support for your work to do regenerative work. And it's I think it's a pre-competitive layer in that, and that people certainly participating in the GRC don't see each other as competing with each other. They see each other as, in a
It's more of a collaborative environment.
It's a mutual benefit society. Yes, exactly. It's intended as a collaborative environment. And then ideally projects and businesses will grow out of the soil that is the GRC. And we want to see, people having a real impact on regenerative work around the world. That hopefully has been aided and assisted and accelerated by their interactions in the GRC.
Sure. Well, and again, from a system standpoint, it only makes sense that this kind of organization would come to light and others like it, and that there would be this almost a magnetism for those that are seeking. And this is what I was talking about, the internet being the global brain, and we're learning how to pick it, right? And it seems, and I don't know if I may be totally off the wall with this, but understanding energy and the electronics and how we carry our own electromagnetic field, and the internet, has its own electromagnetic field, and that we're 99% space, right? As we know from science now. I'm curious as to whether you notice the interaction of that and unexpected things showing up that you're looking for, without really taking the deep dive or having the tenaciousness to be out looking, that they just kind of plop in as you're in process of doing things. Do you experience that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. We talk about, kind of increasing the probability of serendipity.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of that. And I do believe that's a little bit of the magic of the internet, or what Stephen Johnson calls the adjacent possible, right? It's, the new ideas come from like two things coming together that didn't used to come together. And the internet enables that more quickly, I think, more easily. And we see that in the GRC for sure. I think people's ideas are influenced by the just bumping into each other in a context they didn't expect to.
Sure.
And then the other thing that I've definitely seen is there is a sense-making component, I think, of the GRC, more so than I probably had expected, in that you start to feel more of the concerns or the interests of people, or the needs of the environment, because of the interactions. It just kind of floats out of the ether or something. So that's
do you find that they're supportive of because there's two sides of things going on here. There's the regenerative opportunities, and whether it be a business or farm or whatever, that are developing in the outer side of things. And then there's the inner, the self-awareness and self-development that seems to be happening simultaneously.
I think so. And I think I had underestimated that. I mean, I kind of come from a technology, public policy background, kind of a, old white technocrat guy. And I had, I think, underplayed or downplayed or not been aware of maybe kind of personal wellness, personal trauma as things that needed regeneration or were a component of regeneration. And that's something that's been brought to the fore for me in the GRC. Is just, if you watch what people are interested in discussing, or where they're approaching topics from, often there is this personal well-being component of that. That I've like it's dawned on me because of my interactions with the GRC, and I'm still trying to understand it better. But some of it's as simple as like eating better, more nutritious food, from a
Right.
regenerative farm.
Right.
But some of it's more, like how do you deal with colonialism and appropriation of ideas. So there,
Sure.
it goes kind of.
Now, have you noticed it within yourself any new insights into your own being as well as the reflection of others?
I mean, probably harder for me to see it in myself, but
Yeah, you're too
maybe in
close.
so many ways. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that.
Well, you're a pretty self-aware guy, from my experience of you.
Yeah, I'm sure. I think that, well, I mean, there's just, if I think of it in terms of things I feel like I'm learning, there are all kinds of things, and some of them at the process level. It's fascinating to interact with a group of people in this virtual space, and how do people work together, and when do they work together, and what information do they share versus not share, and what channels, and time zones are a real pain in the butt. And, these have all been learning experiences from the last 2 years. I think there's a patience that I've kind of become aware of. I feel like I've settled in a little bit more to the notion that these are important issues that I do think you have the epiphany, the momentary realization, but the actual change is slow and it's going to take time. And there's with an optimistic perspective, it will happen. We'll keep pushing, but you need patience. And I went and visited. I got to spend a week down in Mexico at a regenerative resort. It's like a beautiful place, Playa Viva. If anybody gets a chance to go, and David's been working on it for 15 years. And he's only a little ways downstream, so it takes a long time.
It does, and change, we expect it sooner, and yet there's that element where there's a lot of moving parts that we don't necessarily consider. I know in my MBA program, there was a quadratic formula that had to do with figuring out what the timeline was going to be for completing a project, right? It boiled down to a simple rule of thumb: is it's going to take you 3 times as long as you think, right? So that alone kind of sets you back on, oh, okay, so you're still anticipating what you need to do and accomplish, although you're only a force of one, and you got to allow others their own process, and it may be shorter or longer than your own, but ultimately it's going to take 3 times as long, because there are things that you just don't think about in the process as to how long those individual items might take, especially like in construction. I do partnering workshops for building road and bridge construction projects, and those are usually 2 to 5 years. So there's these contiguous activities that are taking place, and any one of them could throw a monkey wrench if something goes wrong, right? So it delays the entire project. Well, hopefully, if I do my job well, those kinds of things don't happen. And so in the growth of GRC and what you see happening from a systems and an organizational development standpoint, is there kind of a model that's being used, or is it kind of like DHOC's, chaotic organization where you're looking at what needs to be done and people are just stepping up and doing it?
I do think we're copying some models. I'm not sure how well I've enunciated. I even know which ones we're copying, and but they get introduced in various ways. So we're using some sociocracy as to try to do some of the governance and coordination of decision making.
Could we unpack that for a little bit, because I know that's probably a new term. So here we're going to have an apocalyptic moment, right?
Yeah. Well, and again, I'm a novice at this stuff, but sociocracy is just a set of techniques that are increasingly well codified. I think you can go to YouTube and you can kind of how-to videos on how to implement various decision-making processes using a sociocracy model, and it is intended to help non-hierarchical organizations make progress. So GRC is, is not hierarchical. There's nobody, again, there's really, there's, I suppose we could still, it's not like the internet in that nobody could turn it off. We probably could turn it off, but the intent is not for it to be the driven by the ideas of any one person, but to be supportive of the entire community in the ways
Sure.
that they need. So you want the decision making and the progress to be widely distributed, authority to be widely distributed. And sociocracy is a technology, I would argue, a governance technology that helps support that kind of organization.
Okay. Yeah, I totally understand the challenges in it. In the 90s, I was a co-facilitator for the Arizona Peace, Justice, and Environment Coalition. And it was a 40-member group, but those 40 members were all separate organizations. So we would have quarterly meetings around the state, and wow, sometimes it was like herding cats.
Yeah, I think that's a kind of a similar model, right? Similar set of ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, and it takes a while, part of it's getting to know each other. Part of it is putting in at least the conversational structures or the guidelines, hopefully the foundations of ethics, right? The behavior, how we're going to be with each other, and then taking care of that next layer of, okay, now that we're able to be with each other, what are we going to do together? And so those two things kind of go hand in hand. Do you see that evolving, and are there is it exemplary of that type of model that where people are stepping up and kind of assuming roles, or at least temporarily, that need to be filled?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, I think one level, one part of the role of the GRC, as I interpret it, is again to be this rich soil from which regenerative initiatives grow.
Mm-hmm.
And so that distinguishes it a little bit. It's not the organism itself; it's the soil. So people are interacting, and information is sharing, and resources are being developed.
The mycelium haven't developed yet, right?
Yeah, well, we are, maybe some levels we are helping we are the mycelium, maybe, but we're not the flower. The flower kind of leaves GRC, if you will. So various projects that have incubated inside of GRC, if you will. It's almost a pre-incubator, if you will. So there's not usually an entity per se. There is the notion of entities to be or something. And so at that level, a whole bunch of the action has been just human interaction, pretty much always in this format, because we're on the pandemic. So over the last 2 years, we probably run 700 Zoom sessions. And
That's huge.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think that, they don't tend to have, they're 10 or 20 people, not 200. But they're happening every day, and people are meeting each other. And there's a certain level of kind of trust and camaraderie that grows, I think, out of that. Every Zoom meeting, people introduce each other.
I think that would be a natural process, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and it turns out it was a little bit of an accidental process. I don't think we expected, I think we expected
unexpected
a little bit
consequences, right? Or opportunities, depending on how you look at it.
Yeah, I think we expected them to be a little bit more intentional, that you were going to do Zoom calls because of some purpose. But it turns out the Zoom calls are the purpose in themselves. It's just the opportunity to network and connect is part of what builds the cohesion of the community.
Well, it happens through the communication too. And that seems to be the critical factor in just about anything. Is how do we communicate with each other? Am I speaking the same language you're listening in, right? And being able to determine when we're missing the mark and how to course correct in process and bring it back to the moment in the center, or the activity that is supposed to be present.
Yeah, well, and I think that a lot of what's going on is people trying to discover their shared language. And I think that's still in a part of the regenerative framework, is that I think the language is emerging. I don't think people have necessarily a shared mindset around it yet. And one of the things I like to see. I have a personal kind of annoyance with what I think of as an over focus on climate change. There I said it. And it's not that climate change is not a bad thing. I mean, climate change is a bad thing, but it's just a symptom of broken systems.
Right.
And if we fix climate change, quote, and don't fix the system, we just have to go on to the next problem. So,
well, I think climate change, personally, from what I know, the studies that I've done, there's two things. There's two camps. There's we're the cause and we can do something about it, or at least create, the contributors, maybe not the cause. And then there's the other side where, the earth is going through its own changes and the poles are shifting. And so that's going to cause huge climate changes in process. I mean, the North Pole's moved, what, a couple hundred miles now? And so you've got one side of the ice cap melting and one side reforming.
Yeah, and I don't buy that argument, really. I think that we are facing anthropogenic climate change. People are changing the climate. We're doing it in decades rather than tens of thousands of years. So the other example, I think, is true, but on a scale beyond our current time scale. It really is in thousands and tens of thousands of years. We're seeing changes within decades, and that is anthropogenic. But treating the symptom of climate change is it is extractive of our attention. In fact, a lot of the energy, I think, I argue, goes because it's so useful for fundraising. If you can scare people enough, you can do better fundraising. And
fear factor is always great, isn't it?
The regenerative model to me is supposed to be a positive, optimistic model. The world's going to be better. We're going to have to contribute to make it better. And it's not just climate change. The climate's got to get better. The biodiversity needs to increase. The human health needs to increase. We need to do all these things simultaneously. We don't get to stop and solve one problem while we're addressing the other.
Does it seem like there's, and in your experience, especially in the worlds that you've been in, where communication, group dynamics, camaraderie sometimes gets waylaid by hidden agendas and internal competition, right? How does that, or do you see that kind of old paradigm of the lack of openness in conversation and willingness to be present and listen instead of want to just listen for a little bit and want to present your own ideas? Do you see that changing? Am I making sense?
I don't know if I think it exists. We see spikes of it inside GRC. I mean, GRC is not a very congenial environment for a lot of that. So I think the people who prefer that modality probably don't stay long.
Right. Well, my question is, do you see that evolving? Because we all have a tendency, all of us have some kind of trauma in our background that when we get involved in intimate situations, we get triggered, right? Do you see that happening in some of the meetings, and is that kind of activity subsiding?
I don't think we have enough data to tell whether it's subsiding. You definitely see.
Well, there you go, back to the data guy again, right?
You see the friction.
In your personal opinion, though, do you see people learning how to get along better?
I think you see people getting along better. I don't know that it's any different than they would have otherwise, but I do think that the interaction, when people interact, they tend to build trust with one another.
Right.
And we are able, I'd say, through the GRC to increase the amount of interaction. So I don't think that there's any fundamental change in their personalities as a result of that, but they just had opportunities to interact with people and more people from more places. Right. So it really is global. We have people from a lot of different skill sets, a lot of different backgrounds, a lot of different countries, and they all show up on the same Zoom call and they have a conversation. And so I think that builds kind of the tensile strength of trust more quickly than we would have in other modalities.
Sure.
But I don't think it's fundamentally different. And I think the intentions are with deliberateness. There is this positive outcome that we're all working towards.
Right.
It's not, it's kind of by nature not a competitive outcome. So
Right. Now, do you have other places that you're looking or observing to kind of see how the activities measure up in the overall development of the regenerative community globally?
yeah, I'm trying to check on a bunch of different dimensions. I kind of watch Google Trends to see how different words are emerging, and I follow a number of organizations. I love, Joe Brewer runs this group called Earth Regenerators, which is hugely rich. The Capital Institute's launching a training course on regenerative economics next month that I'll participate in. There's a bunch of great Facebook groups. I'm a big fan of, I think the storytelling around this is going to be really important. We can help people with a narrative that they can imagine this regenerative future, and that's just going to be motivating and exciting. And so I'm a big fan of solar punk, and I try to read solar punk materials, and I love the pictures and things.
Sure.
Yeah.
So how do you see the stories evolving in the process, and the understanding of what needs to be done? We were talking earlier about the business concepts and models and things of that nature that are needing to be present, and that oftentimes we jump into an idea without really understanding all the parameters that we're going to need to deal with. Do you see that as part of, I guess, from a needs assessment standpoint? Do you see that as part of what's developing in GRC and other places where the practical steps and tools are being utilized in a better way, I guess, or even a way where they're being, where you notice that, okay, so yeah, there are some things that we need to be considering that we may not have considered prior to, because of the nature of structure, right? Certain things have to be in line.
I mean, it's all about learning. And I do think we're moving into, I feel like, humanity kind of goes through stages, and this is a new stage. This is a global stage. It's a stage of global interconnectedness.
Right. Kind of a micro of a macro.
Maybe. I don't know. I'm not sure what that one means.
Well, okay, so let me unpack that. The micro being the organization, right? The interaction and the activities, where ultimately there's a macro that could be affected by it.
Yeah. And I think that's maybe that may be exactly right. And the issue is that traditionally, I think we've studied the individual organizations. They're very important, but now the individual organizations aren't enough. It's the connectedness across the organizations that matter, which is kind of a new level of engagement. So,
and people having tools,
you're going to have much bigger level of ecosystem analysis than that.
Right. Now, do you find the sharing aspect of the tools and information and things to be much more than you would experience in traditional organizations?
I mean, I think that one of my critiques of the regenerative space is that there aren't enough tools yet. So there's not kind of the infrastructure that we need to develop to share. We're using infrastructure that's been developed in the previous generation. So, the internet, as we were discussing earlier, the internet is this massive shared tool set that is largely available in the public sphere, right? All of the software, a lot of the critical software protocols, and are available for anybody to reuse and reuse. So
provided the tools are available to access it.
Yeah, but a lot of times the tools, I mean, the basic tool, you have to have connectivity and you have to have a computer and things, but the actual intellectual property is free to be reused for a large chunk of the internet. And that model of having large chunks of reusable internet intellectual property, I think, is an important model of the regenerative future. In some sense, that's abundance. Abundance is the fact that these resources can be used and reused at little or no cost. So that's a huge component of what I think will allow us to be regenerative going forward. Yeah, and then I think that it's also important to kind of there are a group of mentors who have framed this over the last couple of decades and have a great understanding, can really teach it. So
Right.
Carol Sanford's book on responsible business is it should be a Bible for people who want to run a business and to think towards what it looks like to have a business that contributes into a better future. The work of Regenesis. In terms of organizing, how do you think about a project and what are the steps you go through and to end up with these outcomes, really fundamental. They've been developing those for decades now.
Yeah, one of my first guests was Dr. Robert Gilman. I don't know if you're familiar with him. Okay, so yeah, he's been going at it for 40 plus years now, just focusing on the notion of being in harmony with self, others, and nature. And that's tends to be where I find the core of regenerative attitude is in that basic foundation, right? And you don't have, and the reason I asked about the sharing of tools through each other and the willingness to, if you've got something, share it rather than hoard it. I remember years ago, WorldCom, when their demise, they basically went down because one of the directors in one of their locations had a piece of software that would allow all the other locations to communicate with each other, and he wouldn't share it.
Oh, I don't know that story. Yeah, I know WorldCom collapsed.
And that was the reason that they imploded, was that there was one person that withheld, right? So if you have one person withholding, it's just going to cascade through the rest of it. Where what I see in the regenerative community is just the opposite, which is a huge shift in paradigm.
Yeah, I think that the regenerative community represents this potential for interconnectedness, right? And yeah, that's got to be that. To me, I don't really see a way forward that doesn't include just a ton more cooperation and collaboration.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, would you consider it to be kind of a new millennial holistic model where for instance, in holistic education, we talked about body, mind, and spirit. We don't include planet yet. So this is the next phase where now this is being included.
That's a great observation. Yeah. I do feel like we're seeing enunciations of these ideas from a lot of different directions, and there's no one word or common language. And I think that'll develop, but it is emerging. And I think a lot about restorative justice, which integrates people back into society as opposed to excluding them from society, seems to me to be very regenerative. But you won't hear restorative justice practitioners talking about regeneration necessarily. Those words don't overlap, but the philosophies, right, I think, are very aligned.
Sure.
And it sounds to me like what you're saying, is also there's just a sphere of activity and intellectual energy, but the spheres aren't really connected yet. So
I call it the thoughtmosphere, right? Where it contains everything. It just depends on how you look at it. And for me, I've always kind of been a cognitive scientist. I look for patterns in myself, my own thinking, and in the world. And what seems to be a burgeoning trend, if you will, are the recognition of patterns. That's part of what biomimicry is, right? It is recognizing the patterns in nature and being able to utilize those for human development and product development or service development, all those kinds of things. And I think that's a huge leap forward, which turns that inner desire to be part of a whole, because we all, I think the core of us truly want to belong and feel like we belong, or maybe even deeper than that, we just want to love and be loved. And that these aspects of self manifest in who we engage, what we do, the kind of work that we do, and especially now with this regenerative trend that's happening, especially coming out of COVID, where we were talking about the care and compassion towards each other. It's not just toward each other. We have to have it towards the planet too. And being able to understand its natural rhythms and cycles and patterns and how to interact with those more appropriately, so that we maybe are a little more utilitarian.
Yeah, well, I suppose you're kind of also identifying one of the gaps, which is that, you know, and somehow we see ourselves as other than the planet when we're actually interconnected with it. So
even more so, if you take it down to a basic elemental level, how do we build our bodies? Where's the material come from to do so?
yeah, right.
It comes from the planet, it comes from the soil, you know, and ultimately a lot of that we consider, at least some of the, I don't know, more lofty thinking, say, yeah, we're all stardust, right? So this, if we're all stardust and there's 99% space, then what's managing it all in that space that we don't really comprehend or understand, yet we see evidence, like we were talking about the serendipitous moments, right? Where everything seems to align as though it were crafted by some unknown intelligence and placed in front of us for us to engage. Are there many who you're aware of in the organization that recognize those kinds of things and maybe even talk about them more? Or is that something still that's not quite brought to the surface yet?
Those things, say again, what do you mean by those things? And what
the recognition that there is this, whether you want to call it an unseen hand, a force, God, right? The infinite intelligence that's operating in this, let's say the substrate of the thoughtmosphere, that's beginning to reveal all these things. And the more people are attempting to align with natural orders, the more that this becomes present and the more serendipity occurs.
Interesting. I wouldn't say that there's much discussion of kind of the unmoved mover or the invisible hand. There's a lot of conversation around spirit, and I think there's a lot of conversation around. I mean, there's an assumption, I think, of a human autonomy, but increasingly modeled after the wisdom of nature. So to the extent that there is, you know, kind of this intellect embedded in nature, which there seems to be, then, you know, a whole bunch of the focus is around how do we understand that, how do we contribute, and how do we benefit from that wisdom. Yeah.
Right.
But
right.
what can we learn from the millions of years? Yeah.
Sure. And it would seem that that also has the opportunity to get us out of the separative notions that the various religions have presented, because that, you know, everybody comes comes from some culture, some religious background, and some of those are in conflict with each other, seemingly. Right.
I see I take your point there, and it's true that, you know, the interactions that, I mean, there are many people in GRC who are religious and they come from different religious backgrounds. I think there is a commonality almost universally around some of the shared principles of, you know, the golden rule, if you will.
Right.
And so you know, all the religions meet back at a set of principles, pretty much, and
sure,
and those are represented, I think, in this regenerative future.
And GRC seems to be, and others like it, seems to be the magnet that attracts people, are the intention to do good, to be better, and to be helpful toward each other and towards the planet in some way.
I think there's a strong drive that, you know, people can actually contribute. And I think one of the assumptions of a regenerative future is that there is, you know, more surplus, or there's more, and more is, you know, in what categories, but people push against the idea of growth kind of as the goal. And I agree that's problematic, but but we can make the world a better place, and that, you know, betterness is something that's shared.
Right.
So,
Do you see it promoting the notion of being more interdependent rather than dependent? Because I know for massive communities like where I live, right, we're dependent on the grocery stores or the farmers markets or, you know, wherever we get our nourishment from. And in the regenerative community, it's more, it seems to be focusing more on the interdependence and maybe even the self-dependence of doing the things that are necessary and not necessarily depending on other sources.
I think
That
that
makes sense?
there's I mean, I know personally I have kind of a belief in increasing interconnectedness, that the systems are all connected, and it's whether they're human systems or human and natural systems. I mean, we are interconnected whether we choose to be or not.
Or
And
see it.
a lot of, or see it, exactly. And a lot of times the emphasis in terms of you're trying to, in the GRC, a lot of times you have change makers who are trying to affect the system. The insight tends to be more local, to look at the system in a more local context, but also to see that local system in more of a natural systems way. So to be a watershed or a landscape that somehow got an integrity to it. And so you're trying to engage in the natural system in a way that is not befitting of the natural system.
Right. And it seems also that how do you see the local, rather than me just say it, how do you see the the old adage of think global, act local, right? Do you find that there's a simultaneity of the two in the virtual world, where you've got people coming together, that are from all over the world?
I mean, I guess it's a funny little contradiction in terms, but
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like a lot of the intent of the GRC is to have a global awareness of this local focus, and I do feel like there's a lot of shared insights that it helps to engage. You have to engage in the world kind of where you are, I think, but there's a lot of people who can share that engagement and can learn from each other globally. So
you mentioned it. I think that's a great point, is that we really can't affect things that are not under our control or distant, or oftentimes we waste a lot of time and energy thinking or feeling about those things which we have no control over, when what's right in front of us is so available and interactive, or potentially, if we so choose, right? Because it's almost a global overwhelm that tends to make people immobile, for lack of a better, right? They just don't know what to do, and so they just do their daily things, go to the jobs and whatever that may be, and they don't really think beyond, okay, well, how can I make the world a better place? Because it's all about meeting my personal needs or my family's needs and being able to pay the bills. How do you see the regenerative community affecting that paradigm in a constructive way?
I mean, I guess I feel like the messages, there's kind of a bunch of implicit messages in this notion of a regenerative future that are kind of transparent. They have to do with trying to not to hoard resources, because resources should be should be shared, or the connection that we can we can benefit each other, or like you were pushing on before, kind of cooperation versus competition. That there are kind of basic themes in the mindset that make it more pleasing to participate in social, kind of in a social context, in a local context, and really generative. You can't, like visiting that regenerative farm at the at the beginning of the session. You can smell the difference.
And taste it as well, I'm sure, the food that's produced, right?
It feels different.
Do you think this might be like the beginning of a shift in a more of a global consciousness of how we interact with each other, and it's bringing things back to a local interactive level and making it a bit more personal, where it's been so disparate, disconnected, and devastating to some?
I do think it's I mean, I hope that it is a global movement, and I think of it as a paradigm shift. It felt like a paradigm shift for me, to move kind of from a sustainable to a regenerative framing. And I don't know that it's exclusively local. I think that, national policymakers should internalize this regenerative thinking in national policy. I don't think it's restricted to local actions or local.
Well, that means we got to figure out how to get people active in the process of politics, right? So
I think there's a lot of possibility in kind of a regenerative politics. Yeah, I think so.
Do you see the willingness of people to become more involved at even whether it be a vocal level or an interactive level or even running for office level? Do you see that as being a potential, and that people are ready to support that kind of activity on a more population-based level?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I mean, I suspect it's a little bit.
I know we're speculating here, but
Yeah.
there's certain things that we kind of see indicators of and say, well, maybe this is possible. And you look around, it's like, well, yeah, I see it happening over there, and it's happening, it's over there, and maybe it is happening.
Yeah.
We don't
Yeah,
really
I
have
think
the
that,
bird's eye view, right?
I mean, I kind of look at, you certainly see a bunch of energy in emerging around politics over the last, 5 or 6 years. That's new energy, and I feel like, to me, one of the messages from a regenerative future is that it is an optimistic, positive message. I feel like a lot of our framing has been negative, so I'll find myself trying to take a sentence and remove the not, kind of to try to change the framing from a
Right.
negative to a positive view. And I wonder about things like defund the police, where a lot of the message behind that was really positive, constructive, better for the world, but it came with a negative framing. And so, like, if we could have had, enable a safer country, or I don't know, some other reframing of that was positive, would it have played out better? And I think I want to hope that the optimistic versus the fear-based policy messages will be successful, and that we see that in politics. And that's an empirical question. I guess we'll find out.
It certainly would seem that the more open and interactive that people are, the greater opportunity for growth in a positive way. And I certainly agree, words are powerful. It's how you use them, and the mind doesn't hear not, right? It doesn't, it hears the subject. And if the subject is of a negative order, it's going to have that negative connotation in the internalization and perception of it. But if you use a different word that accents it in a positive way, then you're going to have that positive reflection. And that's just a natural, almost a spillover of the activity of communication and using the language and the words, right? There was a guy, oh gosh, I forget when the book came out. Author was Howard Bloom. It was called the Lucifer Principle. You're probably familiar with. He also wrote The Global Brain, which kind of is the activity we were talking about earlier. In the Lucifer Principle, it has nothing to do with Lucifer, but what he expresses is this scientific historical view of how small groups of people manipulated masses simply by controlling the media stream, whether it was a town crier or now you've got the mainstream media. So there are these things that, do you think people are aware of how they're being manipulated yet?
I think there's
Would you agree with that they are, first of all, I guess, and how might they be showing that awareness and making the changes that are necessary?
Yeah, it seems to be hard to deny that they are being manipulated, at least in, certain environments, or especially in certain environments, maybe. I think the stories about, Facebook's algorithm manipulating the angry reaction, is pretty telling. And then people, angry is a pretty good thing to manipulate if you want to manipulate people. So that's one of the questions I think that's open for regenerative futures. If we
and it gets people out
tamp
of
down angry.
Sure. But one positive thing about it is it gets people out of the passive mode.
Well, it's only positive if it gets them into a positive mode. So
Sure.
if you get them into a positive, you activate them into a negative mode, then I'm not sure we've made any progress.
Well, there's always that possibility. It's like I talk a lot about New World Order and my concept of it, but the phrase alone, right, carries a huge charge for most people.
There's a burden on that term, yes.
Right. And yet when it was given to me, it's back 1975, it was a concept of harmony among people and planet, simply.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That's
so today, that would be people and planet over profit instead of profit over people and planet agenda that's been running the show. So do you see that changing?
The profit first modality?
Yeah, the shift from profit over people and planet to people and planet over profit.
I think we see some energy towards that. I guess this has been part of my frustration, is that it's probably too slow and we need something more aggressive than that. So it's not enough to simply reframe profit in that equation, but to actually change the entire equation to, the outcome needs to be a better world, and then people, planet, and profit are kind of components of the outcome. So certainly we're seeing a change from, profit first, even I think in economics and in a lot of business, the World Business Council, they probably won't argue for the Thomas Friedman, business exists for the shareholder value kind of argument much anymore, but it's built into some of the operations of the businesses in such a way that it's hard to overcome.
Well, most of the larger corporations, I think, still are in that stakeholder mode where the profits are essential. And I know I came out of the aerospace industry and watching it grow. And as our company got absorbed by other companies and eventually became Honeywell, there was a definite change in how people were treated. And so that kind of indicates, now this was 30 years ago, right? That has changed and dramatically in that course of time. What I hope is that this nudge that is being given to the overall mindset with the regenerative activity, that kind of like COVID did with the obsession on self-hygiene and sequestration, it gave people the chance to look inside and clean that up as well as their outer environments. And perhaps that's part of what stimulated those to get involved more with the regenerative community in a global scale, because that seems to be one of the areas of focus that would promote that kind of activity, the inner quest for outer service in a demonstrable way.
Yeah, and that might be a good reason to plug the Paul Pullman and Andrew Winston have a new book out that's pushing in this direction of I don't know if they use the term regenerative or not, but a business that is constructive for society. So there are certainly voices and forces that are encouraging this.
Well, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, we talk about common sense and we don't often know that we have it, or at least the results that we get may not, or the activity that happens may not reflect that too much. And yet there's this outpicturing or storytelling that leads one through the logical process to reach a new decision point that opens the door to considering alternatives for activities as opposed to what used to be happening, that there's now this, what even in the virtual world, as you mentioned, you've had over 700 Zoom meetings, and it made that opportunity available. And because of the sequestration, in a lot of cases, people were available to come online. They weren't out, or they were able to do that in addition to working their own bioregion activities. Do you see that as being something that's increasing? Do you see a growth in GRC as a result of that, or is it slow as well?
I think it's still slow, and it'll be interesting to see. I assume at some point it'll kind of end and people will kind of reemerge from their Zoom world. So I'll be curious to see how things change, and whether people will start to meet in person locally, and how things will adopt and how they will adapt. And I think part of the fun of the GRC is it's an experiment in terms of how people want to interact and what they find benefit from each other. It is a laboratory. So how can people benefit by working with each other, and how can they contribute? And a lot of that's just through a discovery process. So the next stage is just part of the adventure.
Sure, and it's a wild one. So for those who are considering that type of activity, what can you offer as practical advice that people could look into or begin to study or research and find out more about things? Or take personal responsibility to become active.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I encourage people to, if you're interested in meeting some other people, there's a group, regenerationpollination.earth is a speed networking series that grew out of GRC, and it's every week or two there'll be a Zoom online sessions where you can do one-on-one.
Is that limited to 240 characters?
It's it's Zoom based, so it's.
I was making a Twitter reference, right?
Yeah.
Because Twitter has changed things in the way we communicate it, and was 140, now it's 240, I think. And man, how can you expect clear communication unless you're a master communicator? And even then, I'm sure there's problems. So in that development, how could you direct people towards material, or maybe even a book or something that you found would be extremely useful?
Yeah, for books and materials both, I think I would go to Carol Sanford's website first. She's got a set of 6 books now that deal with kind of individual regeneration down to business regeneration. And she's probably the most thoughtful person that I know kind of on the topic. So like I said, Track Regenesis is one of the groups that's been really constructive and productive. I think Joe Brewer's Earth Regenerators group is really rich. So there's a number of folks who are kind of doing, opportunities for interactive learning, if you will. If you're interested in gardening and have thought about getting a permaculture certification, I think that's a great step. Yeah, there's just a lot of different directions to go to kind of join in, get a restorative justice training and join in a restorative circle. So
sure.
It doesn't
really matter what you do, just do something.
Well, I think it might matter what you do.
Well, I mean,
do things that are regenerative.
Gosh, you caught me on that one, right?
That is the point. We're trying to become more regenerative. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, David, it's been a great conversation. I really appreciate your time, and I'm sure the value that you offer to our audience is huge. And just being able to discover and talk about this, it's a little bit different than our normal conversations, and yet not so much, because it does highlight the things that we can do and how we can behave towards each other and the planet.
Well, thanks for what you're doing, then. Really appreciate it.
Well, you're very welcome, David. Thanks for coming on again. All righty then. Well, namaste and in la catch. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of One World in a New World. I'm Zen Benefiel, your host, and I'll see you next time.